I was very much inspired by a composer named Ryuichi Sakamoto, who recently passed away maybe about 2 weeks ago, who is a Japanese composer who created music for a number of movies more familiar in the West. For instance, The Last Emperor, and obviously we all know David Bowie was the actor in the movie Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence, and Sakamoto-san had been the major role, or had played a very major role in the music. And his background actually comes from an electronic background. He has a long history in production back in, I think, in the 70s, among other musicians. And my first inspiration of hearing his song, not realizing it was him, was in fact a piece written for a movie back in 1984, 1985 in Japan called The Adventures of Chatora, or the West would know it as The Adventures of Milo and Otis. I believe that's what it was, Milo and Otis. Now, I didn't know that they had a translation version of that particular movie. And the music was totally different. So I was like, well, the visuals make sense, but it didn't make any sense because the compositions were not the same. So the West likes to like readjust and alter songs and movies. I mean, they do that with anime too, right? So translations always get lost in translation. It's always the case. And besides that, obviously you can see I'm also wearing an Issey Miyake jacket, a very rare piece. I'm very inspired by Japan. Issey Miyake has just passed away too. So bringing both the composer and Issey Miyake together for me is like, I thought this would be a great video to start the intro to music production. In fact, Issey Miyake was known to have instrumental and very interesting music for his personal fashion shows. Most likely, they both worked together. I don't know the history, but it would be interesting to look into that as well. Okay, going back into music production and technology. So I was always inspired by this particular song. I'll probably play it in a few moments and I'll switch over to another room with my equipment. And there was no sheet music for this piece. And as a child, the first thing that I would do is automatically go listen to, well, we didn't have YouTube. I'm 43, and they didn't have DVDs. They had cassette tapes and VCRs. So we would have another way of learning music besides having sheet music, which you sometimes just couldn't find. And YouTube and the internet just didn't exist back then. So our mechanism to understand music was a little bit different. And so I became a musician besides learning how to read music, somebody that was very into playing by ear. A lot of my teachers, all the teachers I had issues with this playing by ear thing. I think it probably took their job out of perspective. But it's important to understand both sides, the playing by ear and reading the music. And I know there are two different types of people out there musically who have two different skills, or you probably just have both skills, like myself. I have both skills. I can pick up a piece and listen to it and probably learn how to play it from like that perspective. And then I could always learn a piece with sheet music and figure it out from there too. So there are two perspectives, and you probably do need to have one or the other, maybe both would be preferable, to understand music production. I'm going to get more in depth into talking about GarageBand and Logic Pro X. Now, there were other music softwares way back in the day before I was even born, probably in the 50s. I just read it up earlier. I thought it was Logic Pro X, but it's not. The very first music software that was out there was actually called Music. Can you believe it? That makes sense. So I'm not going to get more in depth into that, but I just wanted to probably discuss how the beginnings of music production came about and why we are in a world right now where we're living in a situation where it's more accessible for the general public to have the softwares and the capabilities, which never happened before, because, you know, musicians would have to go into a recording studio to record, and they still do, but on like music equipment that was absolutely larger than life, because the computers back then were not small computers like we have now. They're like big houses. They look like houses. They were enormous, and it looked like a soundboard that you would use for, I think, if you're in a TV environment, if you're working for television, you have the huge soundboards and you have to plug in different things for the sound and the visuals, and everything kind of happens. So music was sort of like that before. And before, you know, you had the things called loops that we now create individual or tracks from. The musicians would have to actually create the loops. Now, I studied music production, my very first experience studying music production in Japan when I was living there I lived there twice when I was a child, so I spoke Japanese fluently, which is why I'm very much inspired by the East versus more of the West. I'm a little bit more of an East Asian, Eastern Asia type of person, because I kind of just grew up there. And first it was the classical. Obviously I learned the classical when I was younger and the formal training, and then I kind of branched off and started learning to play by ear, which was my thing, and I play piano. And I studied drums in high school when I moved back to the States. But there are like lots of countries, so I was in and out of different countries. And music production became a big thing for me when I studied music production in Tokyo in 1998. Now, I can't remember the software that I used, but I do remember that we had to create individual loops. Like, you had to make your own sound. So if you had a chord and you had to come up with an idea, you needed to create the chord. You couldn't just go in with what you can do now with Logic and GarageBand and find a loop that you like and just plug it in and make it work. You actually needed to break it apart and figure it out and make sure the beat was right and the timing was good and mold the piece together. And obviously you can cut and paste, which you can still do now. So there was a different mechanism of how things were constructed in the world of technology and music than there is now. It's just easier for the masses to do. Then it was a little bit more complex, and there was a little bit more detail that went into the stuff, the pieces. I do think it is important to have a little bit of music education. I do think creating a composition is not just about the sound, not just about how cool it is, but there are some technical things that you probably need to learn the basics of before you jump into really understanding Logic Pro X and GarageBand. I will start talking about how and where you can find. Now Logic Pro X you need to pay for. GarageBand is free. And Logic Pro X and GarageBand you can actually find on Apple items. So anything Apple, not the apples you eat, but Apple, computers and all those things, will generally have GarageBand. And before, GarageBand was only accessible on your desktop and your laptop. And now you can have, once you upgrade, you can now have the new version of GarageBand, which is pretty close to what Logic Pro X looks like. And I know there's a Logic Pro X10 or Pro 10X. I don't have that. I have the Logic Pro X. I will probably eventually upgrade to Logic 10 Logic Pro X10, Logic 10X. And yeah, so there's like a process. So you have to learn whether it's understanding music with playing by ear and you picking up songs and you know how to put them together on some sort of instrument. I would highly recommend it. Or you learn from ground zero to play pieces, learning how to read the music. And I know people want to take a hop, skip, and a jump, and I was there. I learned how to play the music, I learned the sheet music, and I thought maybe that's a way around it. And now that YouTube is around, you can definitely use YouTube, and I've been teaching other students before to play by ear. There's no question about the fact that you can do it. It's not impossible. So composition, not just learning the process of how to use the piece, but composition becomes an important role. Say for instance, you want to record an album, and obviously if you're producing your own tracks, you don't have to worry about copyright infringement, right? You're creating everything on your own by yourself, or you have a group, and then you split the copyright discussion between whoever's in the group. And most likely somebody on the group must have ASCAP. And in each country, you will have the royalty right companies that you decide to join. They'll be different, but they'll be generally the same thing. In South Africa, it's SAMRO. And once I arrived back to the States, I had to switch over, which was an impossible task, and set up an ASCAP account, which would be beneficial for everybody, so that there are no concerns and problems about who owns the rights to the music, right? And look at Facebook, for instance. Facebook is blocking people. I mean, I'm going through this right now. They're blocking people on Facebook who are, well, if you're going to want to be monetized, or if you want to do the ads, if you're using other people's music. Now, I get that. I understand that there's like a whole thing behind copyright infringement. So the best thing to do is to learn how to create the music yourself, whether it's for your videos or, I mean, you can learn the basics of Logic Pro X and GarageBand. I do highly recommend starting with GarageBand first, because GarageBand gives you that open-ended capacity to practice on a simpler scale. Like I said, Logic Pro X and GarageBand are basically the same thing. It's just Logic is a little bit more advanced, and that's what the difference is. So I think, yeah, that's where I am with production. I have put stuff on iTunes myself. They weren't fantastic because I was much younger and I was exploring how to do that, which I did. So I know how to do it. It's not difficult. You can do it without all these other companies like CD Baby and I think like a whole bunch of other things that are out there. Spotify might probably set you up, or Reverb Nation is the same. There are a lot of apps that you can use to upload your own music onto other platforms. I use SoundCloud. SoundCloud has just been around a lot longer than all the other platforms, so that was my kind of like go-to. I haven't used it a lot, but I know if I want to make sure that nobody steals my music, that would be the first place to go. Or even before that, you submit your track to ASCAP, and ASCAP reconfirms it, and then from there, you can then post it on SoundCloud. But SoundCloud, as I've noticed, they actually do question if there is a confused track that sounds like it might be similar to something that sounds like somebody else's, they will ask you to verify it, which is why it's always important to have the software on your computer to make sure if they do ask, any place for that matter, you have the facts and you have the separates and you have the parts, and you can take a photograph if you want to, or send them an email of a video clip that you have of that particular music. So there are many, many positives about learning how to create your own music. There's no question about it. So I will be here to start discussing that. I will I will give you an example of a song that I learned by ear, which is the Ryuichi Sakamoto piece from Adventures of Chatoran, or the American version of, well, the Japanese version and the original of that Oliver, Milo, and The Adventures of Milo and Oliver, or Oliver and Milo, I can't remember which way it goes. I don't know why they took out his music. I was absolutely shocked. I was like, this is the same movie, but the music is so different. What happened there? So yeah, it's and in fact, the music that he did for that particular movie, I still have not found the sheet music, and I don't know why I haven't found the sheet music. It's an absolutely gorgeous piece. And when I played it for my other music, other channel that I have, a lot of people were very interested to hear more about it. So that's why I thought maybe starting with talking about Ryuichi Sakamoto, and even bringing up a little bit about Issa Miyake. They both passed away from cancer. I thought was an important place to begin. You gotta start somewhere, and my experience has always been living in Japan. So living in Japan was a big influence in how I go about doing music and live my life. And my husband's Cambodian, who spent a lot of time with friends that were Japanese. So I'm like, okay, well, I'm not speaking the Japanese anymore, but I'm definitely around and surrounded by people who appreciate the culture. And, you know, anime is a big thing. So I'm all about anime and the Japanese music to go with, like Totoro and Mononoke Hime. Now, my music students that I have right now are learning songs like Totoro and Merry-Go-Round of Life, which is great. I am inspired when people say I want to learn something. I'm always willing to give them more than, you know, I'll find a way to make it happen. And sure enough, it will always happen. And my dream is to be a producer in an environment where I've set up my own space and put it together, which I have to an extent. I also worked at Guitar Center. I worked at Bach to Rock. I don't know if you know, I think Bach to Rock's also like a global thing. And oddly enough, Bach to Rock was started by my art director from my old college at the Corcoran. And the Corcoran now has music production and all these wonderful things. So I'm like, okay, so I had done all of this stuff before the university was actually doing it. So I'm thrilled. I'm thrilled where I am right now, and I know this is the way forward for me.